Hello and welcome to Buying Abroad. My name's John Howell and I'm a lawyer, a partner in the International Law Partnership, and I've been dealing with international property law now for nearly 25 years. And I've been asked for these seminars to share some of that experience with you. So whether you're a novice or an experienced investor, this is your guide to investing in property overseas safely and successfully. You may have seen my introduction to investing in overseas property or other seminars in this series. If not, go to our website. But this seminar is a more detailed look at the 30 things you really must know before you start to invest abroad. And the first thing you need to know is that there are in fact 31 things, because the first is that not all property is going to make you money. The people who make money out of property abroad are the people who buy carefully, they buy the right property, and they treat the whole thing as a business. So the first of the steps that you have to take is do your research. You do your research before you get on an aeroplane to look at properties. I'll say this again later on, but getting on the aeroplane is the last stage in the process, not the first stage. When you're doing your research, you may also want to take some advice to fill in the gaps that you don't feel that you can answer yourself. Then you need to decide who is going to be the owner of the property. This doesn't sound important, but it's probably the most important single decision you'll make in the whole of the investment process. Because if you get it wrong, it will cost you thousands and thousands of pounds of totally unnecessary fees and taxes during your lifetime and on your death. Then you need to sort out your finances again before you go to look at any properties. Decide, are you going to borrow, how much, where, in this country or overseas. Then you're going to choose your area and make a preliminary selection of type of property. I say a preliminary selection at this point because the next stage is to talk to an experienced property rental management organisation. Why do we do that? Because it can save you time, it can save you money, and better still, it can make you money, and better still, it's usually free. Because these people, if they know their area well, will be able to say to you, if you're interested in buying a property to let in this area, then this is the place to buy. This is the place, even down to street level. And they will then say, if you buy that property, then if you furnish it in such and such a fashion, you'll be able to rent that out for 40 weeks a year, and we'll be able to generate you X in the way of rental income. And that's invaluable information which may cause you to change your mind about the type of property you were going to buy. You might have thought, I'll buy a one-bedroom apartment, but following that advice you might change it for a two-bedroom apartment or a studio apartment because it's going to perform better for you. And then you go and choose the actual property you're going to buy, and of course following that come the legal steps. Well, I suppose we really ought to start with a quick look at why are you thinking of investing in real estate at all? And the answer is that for most people, the stock exchange really hasn't done very well over the last 10 years or so, and the pension funds have probably done even worse. My personal view here is we ought to take the fund managers out and shoot them, because I think they've destroyed a whole way of saving in this country, but that's another matter. People have seen very good performance from real estate investments over the last 10, 15, 20 years, and many people think that real estate in the UK is probably on a bit of a plateau. Not many people predicting 15, 20, 25, 30% growth per annum on property in the UK, whereas they can see the potential for that growth in property abroad, particularly in the emerging market countries. They also see low interest rates in many countries, and if you've got the ability to borrow, and as they say, leverage your investment, borrowing at 4.5%, an investment that's growing at 10, 15% a year and generating you, say, 6% a year in rental income, then that looks like a pretty good deal. There's also something I think is grossly underestimated, and that is the fringe benefit of owning real estate abroad. If you have a buy-to-let property in Birmingham and you live in Birmingham, then all the time that property is empty is going to be dead time, a waste of money, and it will be empty for a number of weeks per year, however well you let it. If you have a buy-to-let property in Marbella or in Paris or in New York, then every time that's empty, it is a holiday opportunity, and quite possibly a tax-deductible holiday opportunity, because of course you're not going on holiday, you're going to do essential repairs to your property. But I think the main reason people, my clients at least, invest in property abroad is that it's a good, simple, old-fashioned investment. They are tired of these sophisticated, high-tech, financially engineered products which fall apart at the seams in dramatic fashion. The idea that you own a house, someone wants to live in it, they have to give you money, is not a challenge either to you or to them. Now, the property investment is also encouraged by the investment curve, which we see here. And that investment curve is, broadly speaking, the same in all of the markets we look at. It actually starts about 5 yards over that way, because for years and years and years, property simply does not go up in value. It stays more or less the same. And that's maybe because it was a communist country where people didn't own property, or maybe it was just a poor country. A country where the land that you think is so valuable, being beachfront property, for them is just absolutely hopeless desert with no value at all, because you can't even graze goats there. And then what happens is someone comes along and finds a bit of that beautiful beach with waving palm trees, and they say, yes, I would love to own a bit of that, and they have a major job on, but eventually succeed in buying some for next to nothing. And then they tell a few friends, and those friends will go along and buy some property for next to nothing. And then someone like me comes along and writes an article in an investment journal, and the prices start creeping up at 10% a year. And then the Sunday Mail or the Sunday Times writes a piece on the area, and prices go up at 20% a year. And then Real Estate TV comes along and does a television programme, and there are suddenly 1,000 British people looking for bargains, and prices keep on rising at 30% or so a year, until that bit of beach is as expensive as Barbados. And then the prices level out to a sustainable growth pattern. Now, that's what happens to the property curve. That curve then needs to be matched to the curve of what is happening to your investments generally. And you'll see that if you look at a period of time, and this graph goes back to 1983, for no more sinister reason than I couldn't get any more lines on the page, but if you go back to 1983, if you had invested in the FTSE All-Share Index, which is the sort of light blue line, or in the hypothetical average British property, which is the red line, or in the London property, the green line, or a property in Paris, the yellow line, then the average British property would have outperformed the FTSE All-Share Index over that period. The London property would have substantially outperformed the index, and even the Paris property would have done nearly as well as the FTSE and slightly better than the French equivalent. You'll notice also how much less volatile the property investments are than the stock exchange. Of course, the stock exchange goes up and down, and so does property. But property goes up and down a lot less than the stock exchange. Now, those figures are only for capital growth. But of course, when you're buying an investment, you're not just buying capital growth, you are buying capital growth and income. And broadly speaking, the rental income you get from buying property tends to be more than the dividend yield you get out of shares. And so each year, the property creeps a little bit further ahead by comparison with the FTSE. And so you'll see that by the end of the period, the London property is now miles ahead of the FTSE, but even the Paris property has done slightly better than the FTSE. Now, that's going back to 1983, but as far as I can see, the figures would have looked very similar if you'd gone back to 1963, or for all I know, 1943. Rental returns are another good thing from the investor's point of view because they've been so stable for such a long period of time. For over 50 years now, and 50 years is an eternity in investment terms, we've seldom seen rental yields in major cities outside the range of about 5 to 7%. Compare that with the income from deposit accounts and on bonds, which has been all over the place during that period. And for those of our clients who are therefore looking to property as a long-term asset, as part of their pension fund, that is a very useful feature. I mentioned the property investment curve earlier on. There it is, going up very, very slowly in the early stages, accelerating like mad, whilst the enthusiasm for the area grows and grows, and then eventually levelling off to the point where it becomes a sustainable market. Now, of course, if you can take advantage of that curve and get onto it just where it starts getting steep and jump off just before it flattens out, then you can make an absolute fortune. But it's not that simple. Getting the timing right is difficult. And that's where you need to know one very important thing about the property investment curve. And that is that once it starts, it almost never goes into reverse. It takes either a political disaster or a natural disaster to make it go back on itself. And for that reason, many of our clients wait to the point just after where it has started to grow, just after the point where it is getting steep, and they voluntarily throw away all of the early growth in return for the certainty or near certainty that they've got 4, 5, 6 good years ahead of them, at the end of which time they can review their investment plan and decide what to do next. Now, the impact of that is purely mathematical, and most of us are very bad at maths. If you buy a property in a place that grows in value at 6% a year, which would be typical of much of the UK, much of the United States, much of France, many of the emerged markets, then after 15 years, your £100,000 property becomes worth £210,000. Pretty good. But if you buy in a place that grows in value at 20% a year, then after 15 years, your £100,000 property is worth £1.5 million. And that's a massive difference in the bottom line based on what looks like a relatively trivial difference in the top line numbers. And that's why our clients are looking for places which are going to grow at 15 or 20% a year, not at 5 or 10. Now, I don't know anywhere in the world that has grown at 20% a year for 15 years. I can think of a lot of places that have grown at 20, 25, even 30% a year for 4 or 5 years and then slowed down to perhaps 10 or 15. And I can think of a number of places that have grown at more or less 15% a year for 15 years. So those big numbers are doable. I always give 2 examples of this, which I think underline the point. One of the very, very early deals I was involved in, way back in about 1985, 1986, involved the purchase of a big piece of land in the province of Almeria in Spain. Massive piece of land, hundreds of acres, tens of thousands of square meters. We paid the princely sum of 1/4 of 1 penny per square meter for that land. Now, it didn't have building permission, but it was near to a place where other people were building, and it was likely to get permission. 5 or 6 years ago, we sold that piece of land for our client at £40,000 1,000 pesetas per square metre, or in other words, £200 per square metre. So from a quarter of a penny to £200 per square metre. That is an enormous profit over, say, a 15-year period. Now, it wasn't all profit. He had to put in water, he had to build some roads in order to get that profit, but big numbers. At a more normal level, we had a client who bought an apartment in Paris in the 4th arrondissement, the Marais, back in about 1985, and she paid the equivalent of 18,000 euros for that apartment, which she has now sold for 480,000 euros. So again, big numbers are doable, provided you buy the right property in the right place. And so, onwards. Next thing we have to do is learn the facts. Learn the facts about the country you're thinking of investing in, or if you're still thinking of several countries, the countries you're thinking of investing in. And that once again comes back to doing research before you go looking at any properties. Can't stress that enough. Going to look at these properties at this stage is a disaster, because you get lured into looking at beautiful houses and making investment decisions based on a gut reaction rather than hard facts. Well, where do you get the information from? We use a whole range of sources in our offices when we're giving advice to our clients about where they ought to be investing. Some of them are very easily accessible and full of useful information. Others take a little bit more finding. Some of the easier ones to start looking at: CIA World Factbook. Just go into Google and type in CIA World Factbook and it'll find it for you, full of basic data about every country in the world. Look at weather information. We use the BBC and USA Today for that. Look at currencies. What's happening to the value of this particular currency? Great site, Oanda, oanda.com, which gives you historic currency data going back for years and years and years, so that you can see what's really happening. Buy some of the magazines. There are some great magazines out there about investing in property overseas. They cost pennies compared to what you're thinking about in investing, so subscribe. And buy some books. Once again, they cost pennies by comparison to what you're investing. There's lots of good books available, I have to say, including the ones that I've written. And then look at the other seminars in this series, or come and see us face to face. A few sample statistics. What size is the country compared to the UK or the country where you live? What size is the population? Is the population growing or contracting? If it's growing, it tends to put pressure on property prices, which from your point of view is a very good thing. And what about the net migration rate? Are people moving to the country or leaving it? Why would I want to invest in a country where 10% of the local population have left in the last 5 years? And there are many countries that fall into that description. What's the size of the economy? Is this a wealthy country or is it poor? And whilst the overall figure for the economy is interesting, the one that we really focus on is the GDP per capita, what's called the purchasing power parity, GDP per capita. That's comparing like for like, so that if there's double the amount, you've got double the purchasing power in the country you're talking about. Now, that is not an absolute tie-in to cost of living, but it's a pretty good indication of the way things are going. And just to give you some examples, the GDP per capita in the UK is $31,400 this year, 40-odd thousand in the US. But go to Bulgaria or Turkey, you're down at the $8,000 mark. Go to the Cape Verde Islands in Africa, you are down at $3,000. So huge, huge differences in purchasing power. And of course that reflects in the ability of local tenants to be able to afford the rents of the property that you're buying. Look at inflation. Is this a country where inflation is going through the roof, or is it under control? And I think an interesting statistic public debt? Is this a country which is absolutely burdened with debt, or is it a competitive economy? And another one, the unemployment rate in the country in question. Now, there are many more statistics that we look at when we're giving advice to clients, but those are some of the basic ones which give you a good steer about where the country is going. Think about home ownership by foreigners. This is difficult. There's a lack of good, reliable information on this point. One or two countries, some of the more advanced countries, have good, accurate information about how many foreigners have bought there and how many are buying each year. But in many countries, the figures are a little bit wobbly. We tend to use our own figures, which we've accumulated over the years. Look at the movement in property prices. What's happened to the price of property in this country over the last 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? And, of course, what's going to happen in future, because future performance isn't necessarily going to be the same as past performance. And compare that growth with what you would have got in your own country, something you're familiar with. Think about the climate. A number of things. Temperature. What's the maximum temperature during the year? The minimum temperature during the year. What's the sunshine level like? All of those things are going to have an impact on your ability to rent the property out to holidaymakers, as will the dreaded question of rain. There are some countries which have virtually no rainfall during the year, where you have a year-round climate. Think about exchange rates. I've touched on this earlier on. This is an absolutely vital consideration. There is absolutely no point at all, if you measure your wealth in sterling terms, buying a property in a country and seeing that property go up in value at 20% a year if the currency is falling through the floor in sterling terms. And we've seen that in many countries in recent years. Your property's gone up at 20% a year, the currency has lost value at 30 or 40% a year, leaving you worse off than you were to start with. Turkey was a good example of that. A few years ago, 5, 6, 7 years ago, the Turkish lira stood at 150,000 lira to the pound. By 2 years ago, it had gone to 3 million Turkish lira to the pound. 3 million. That's a 20-fold reduction in the value of the lira. Now, it doesn't matter how well your property did, it wasn't going to do that well. The government then got that under control, and that was the beginning of the Turkish property boom. Look at the curve that you see on the graph. This one is a typical example of a curve for a country that has come out of the communist era. What you see is that when independence comes, there is a wave of enthusiasm, and people will reflect that enthusiasm. They'll get very keen on the country, and they will then see the price of the currency go up in relation to sterling, euro, dollar. And then reality hits, and very often it collapses again just as quickly, finds a sustainable level, and then moves on. And the knack is buying once you've hit the sustainable level, not at the peak, which is when some people are encouraged to do so. If you look at the graph, you will also see on this particular type of graph a high, low, and average. The red mark in the middle is the average. It's also interesting to see how big the range is during the year. If you've got a currency which is very, very volatile, goes from $1 to the pound to $3 to the pound in very short order, that's a risky place to be. A place where you have got very little movement over the year is probably going to be more stable. So, you've done your research. Now you need to ask some key questions. And we believe that if you ask those questions and answer them honestly and diligently, they will lead you to some very good conclusions about where you ought to buy and what type of property. So much so that we very often say to our clients that by answering those questions, we can narrow down to a radius of 20 miles in the whole world the place that would probably suit them best as an investment opportunity. The first of those questions is, what's your attitude to risk and reward? And most of our clients assume, entirely wrongly, that there is some sort of risk-reward continuum. And that is to say that more risk is more reward, less risk is less reward. And that's just not true. There are some places in the world where you will get way more reward than you have any right to expect for the modest amount of risk you're being asked to take. And there are other places in the world which, to my way of thinking, are just plain suicidal, but where the level of reward is nowhere near big enough to justify the risk you're being asked to take. That means that if we're clever, we can find the sweet spot. We can find a place where you can get the maximum amount of reward commensurate with the amount of risk you're prepared to take, or flip it on its side, a place where we can get the minimum amount of risk necessary for the amount of reward you've decided that you're looking for. Next question is flexibility. Some of our clients want to invest, but they need to be able to get their money out and use it for some other purpose. Maybe they need to put it into a business. Maybe they want to educate the kids, or whatever the case may be. If that's important to you, there are some places in the world where you will always be able to sell your property, even in bad times. And there are other places where it might be almost impossible. So that will have a big impact on your decision as to where to invest. Another factor that has a big impact is whether you want to borrow. If you are going to borrow money, and it's an important part of your investment plan, then you will want to look at countries where the cost of borrowing is low and where their lending criteria are pretty generous.